The year was 1944. World War II raged across the globe. America fought for freedom and democracy on foreign shores. Yet, back home, a sinister shadow of injustice stretched across the nation. Jim Crow laws reigned in the South. They choked the very life out of African Americans. In this era of segregation and fear, a horrific crime shook the small town of Alcaloo, South Carolina. Two young white girls, Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, were found dead. Their murders sent shockwaves through the community. The authorities desperately searched for a culprit, someone to blame. Their gaze quickly fell upon a 14-year-old black boy, George Stinney Jr. What followed was a gross miscarriage of justice. It would stain the conscience of a nation for decades to come. This is the tragic story of George Stinney Jr., a story of racial prejudice, a flawed legal system, and the enduring power of truth. Alcaloo, South Carolina, was a town divided. The railroad tracks served as a stark reminder of the racial segregation that permeated every aspect of life. On one side lived the white community, on the other, the black community. Life for black residents was a constant struggle against discrimination, poverty, and fear. They lived under the oppressive thumb of Jim Crow. Black people were denied basic rights. They were treated as second-class citizens. In this environment of racial tension, the murder of the two young girls ripped through the community like a tornado. It ignited a firestorm of fear and anger. The white community demanded swift justice. They looked for someone to pay for the heinous crime. Betty June Binnicker, 11, and Mary Emma Thames, 7, were best friends. They lived in the white section of Alcaloo. On the fateful day of March 23, 1944, the two girls went missing. They had spent the afternoon riding their bikes, their laughter echoing through the streets. As evening approached and the girls failed to return home, panic set in. A search party was quickly formed. The townspeople fanned out, desperately looking for any sign of the missing girls. Their worst fears were confirmed the next morning. The lifeless bodies of Betty June and Mary Emma were found in a ditch. They had been brutally murdered. The news of their deaths sent shockwaves through Alcaloo. The idyllic image of the small southern town was shattered. Fear and grief gripped the white community. The authorities faced immense pressure to find the perpetrator and bring them to justice. Their investigation, however, was hasty and deeply flawed. It was riddled with racial bias. Suspicion quickly fell upon George Stinney Jr. and his older brother Johnny. The boys were seen talking to Betty June and Mary Emma earlier that day. This brief encounter, fueled by racial prejudice, was enough to seal their fate.
The Stinney family, like most black families in Alcaloo, lived in constant fear of the police. They knew that even the slightest accusation could have dire consequences.
When officers arrived at their home, George and Johnny were immediately arrested and taken into custody. Their parents, powerless to stop it, watched in horror as their sons were taken away. What happened next would expose the brutal reality of Jim Crow justice. Section 5, a hasty trial, justice denied. George Stinney Jr.'s trial was a sham. It was a grotesque display of racial injustice. The young boy, barely a teenager, was thrust into a legal system designed to oppress and silence him. He was denied even the most basic legal protections.
George's court-appointed lawyer, a white tax commissioner named Charles Plowden, offered a meager defense. I failed to call any witnesses or challenge the prosecution's flimsy case.
The trial itself was a hurried affair. It lasted a mere 2 hours. The all-white jury deliberated for just 10 minutes before returning with a guilty verdict. The speed at which the trial was conducted raised serious doubts about the fairness of the proceedings. It seemed as if George's fate had been predetermined from the moment he was accused. Section 6. The youngest to die, a life cut short. On June 16, 1944, just 83 days after his arrest, George Stinney Jr. was executed. He was only 14 years old, making him the youngest person to be sentenced to death and executed in the United States in the 20th century. The sheer brutality of George's execution shocked the conscience. He was led into the execution chamber. His small frame was dwarfed by the imposing electric chair. The guards struggled to strap him down. His small hands were too tiny for the electrodes. They resorted to using a Bible as a makeshift booster seat. As the deadly current surged through his body, George's eyes remained wide open, forever frozen in a mask of terror and injustice. His death was a horrific testament to the systemic racism that permeated the American justice system. It would cast a long shadow over Alcalá and the nation for decades to come. Section 7. Decades of Doubt, the Fight for Truth. For decades, George Stinney Jr.'s case languished in obscurity. It was a buried chapter in the dark history of racial injustice in America. However, the truth, though suppressed, has a way of resurfacing. In the 1990s, George's case began to attract renewed attention. Civil rights activists, lawyers, and journalists, driven by a sense of moral outrage, started to investigate the case. They unearthed a mountain of evidence that pointed to George's innocence. They exposed the deeply flawed trial, the coerced confession, and the lack of any physical evidence linking George to the crime. Section 8. A conviction overturned, justice delayed. In 2014, 70 years after George Stinney Jr.'s execution, justice, though long delayed, was finally served. The state of South Carolina vacated George's conviction. They acknowledged the grave miscarriage of justice that had occurred. Judge Carmen Mullen, in her ruling, stated that George had been denied a fundamental right and a fair trial. She recognized the profound racial bias that had tainted the entire legal process. While the vacating of his conviction could not bring George back, it served as a powerful indictment of the systemic racism that continues to plague the American justice system. Section 9. Legacy of Injustice. A Stain on America's Soul. George Stinney Jr. A.S. story is not an isolated incident. It is a stark reminder of the countless other black men, women, and children who have been unjustly accused, convicted, and even executed due to the color of their skin. It is a painful reminder of the legacy of slavery, segregation, and systemic racism that continues to haunt America. George's case forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the pursuit of justice is often elusive, especially for those who are marginalized and oppressed. It compels us to acknowledge the deep-seated prejudices that still exist within our society and the urgent need for reform. Section 10. A Call to Action, Breaking the Chains of Prejudice. The tragic story of George Stinney Jr. is a call to action. It is a reminder that the fight for justice is far from over. We must remain vigilant in our pursuit of a more just and equitable society, one where every individual is afforded equal protection under the law, regardless of race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status. We must work tirelessly to dismantle the systemic racism that continues to permeate our institutions and our society as a whole. We must demand accountability from our elected officials and law enforcement